how many of you remember having your mouth washed out for saying a bad word? So about, I'd say, just under half. How many of you occasionally use the F word? How many of you make resolutions from time to time to cease using the F word and then break them? I remember I grew up in a family. My mother was an English teacher, my father was a banker, my father was a brilliant man. And he came to a talk that I gave once that lasted 90 minutes, and everyone was coming up and gushing about it afterwards, and he said, "It's patently," and walked away. Because I had said something that was patently obvious, and he just came up and said, "It's patently." So this tells you why I'm at such a deficit in talking here with Valerie, because she believes that language is what language is. And my father did not believe that. In fact, we used to get into fun little quarrels about words, and he'd say, maybe we should look that up. And invariably, not once in my entire life was I right and he wrong. So this is part of the background of how I got here. And I remember actually at Christmas when I was about 27 years old in our house in Dickinson, North Dakota, I inadvertently said shit. It was the first time that word had ever been spoken in our house. And my sister was 2 years older, so I'm sure she was saying it somewhere else. And I got up and left the room in deep embarrassment. I mean, no one even had to frown. And now I think, where are we now, ladies and gentlemen? Because now that word hardly raises an eyebrow anywhere anymore. So I want to talk about all of this and so much more. I'm so glad, Valerie, that you're here. We've already had some spirited conversations, and there'll be more. So let's get started. And so James, sorry? Yes. So let's get started. We have a kind of preliminary video just to put you in the mood. So let's watch that.
I'm delighted to be joined by a member of the Chinese community as I apologize for using the phrase Chinese whispers. I appreciate that this is deeply offensive to the Chinese. I completely understand why they went totally mental. I'm delighted to be joined by a mental health campaigner to witness my apology for using the phrase, "they've gone mental." I can see some of you are surprised that I'm apologizing, but no. Gone are the days when getting an apology out of me was like getting a fiver out of an Aberdonian, eh? I would like to apologize to the largest Aberdonian community, the Aberdonians. I do understand that Aberdonian feelings are important. I'm surprised, actually, that our diversity officer didn't make that clear to me. Honestly, sometimes around here it's like the blind leading the blind. I would like to apologise to Scotland's blind community. I hear your concerns, and I promise you they will not fall on deaf ears. I would like to apologise to the deaf community. I would like to say sorry. And I realise what I said. Honestly, I had a fit. I apologise unreservedly to all of the epileptics in Scotland for my use of the word fit. I completely understand why you've got a bee in your bonnet. I would like to apologise to anyone connected with bees or the wider bee community. Bees indeed are a vital part of society. I tried my best to get to a statement that wouldn't offend anyone. I really did. But do you know, when me and my advisors get together, honestly, it's like two bald men fighting over a comb. I would like to apologise to Scotland's bald community, of which I am a member. I would like to apologise and exonerate myself. Chief, I'm sorry. Chief, you're forgiven. I was particularly pleased with my final apology because I could apologise and accept the apology at the same time. I do like to kill two birds with one stone. I would like to apologise to the entire avian community for my cruel and insensitive words. I'm sorry.
All right, Valerie, have at it.
I feel like that says it all, honestly. I don't want to offend anybody by saying anything else. I think it's great that we can laugh at it. And we are all laughing at this experience because we've all been there recently. And I think that's really why this is a well-attended presentation is, first, he's here. It's all about him. But also, we've all been in that position where we feel like we're constantly apologizing for our language. And I think my goal here is not to say that we should be always so cautious and that that's the right way to go. It can be very funny how much we have to apologize, but trying to understand how we boundary set in sensitive language.
This is a book that I loved. This has been around for a long time, as you know. Dwight Bullinger's book, Language, the Loaded Weapon. And I love the word, the loaded weapon. Mm-hmm. Language and power, power and language. Talk a little bit about the interface of power and language.
I think we all use language every day for conversations, for connection, for attachment, for social maintenance of bonds. But the reality is we often don't pay attention to the fact that every time we talk to someone, there is some sort of power relationship, power balance that we're negotiating. And that can be between spouses. I think a lot of us have been in situations where we kind of one-up someone with our language, often our beloved. And I think a lot of women were very attracted to You Just Don't Understand, the famous book by Deborah Tannen. How many people here have read that book? All right, so it's an older book, so maybe just a few. But it was a lot about how language can set women up for social failings with their husbands, for feeling like they're not being understood when they're talking to their husbands. And that itself is, while it might seem gender politics related, it's about power, essentially. It's about who has the power, who decides what counts as legitimate discourse. There's also smaller ways that we reify power in the way that we speak to each other by these really subtle things that we do with language that aren't about words, because a lot of us focus on words and the power of words, but are about even the way we position things in a sentence. So who tends to be the subject of a sentence? When we look at studies of compilations of databases that linguists call corpus studies, what we find is it's usually men that are in the agentive roles in sentences and women that are in the object roles in sentences. These are very subtle ways that power is played out through language. But one of the most obvious ways is that it's in the words we choose and who has the power to name. And I think those are two topics we're going to talk about tonight.
Absolutely. So I have a really close friend who regards himself as very enlightened, and he invariably talks about women as gals. And I say to him from time to time, maybe not, why would you call women gals? And he thinks, what's wrong with it? So people frequently don't know the implications of the words that they use. Sometimes we do, more often we don't, right? Often
we don't. And language usually evolves over time so that the meanings we're using them for today are very much distant from the etymological origins they started with. And often they've changed meanings and we don't have any clue about the origin of meaning. So, the word lewd, how many people would like to be described as lewd today? Probably not many of you. Hopefully not many of you, but it actually just meant non-ecclesiastical in the 13th century. It didn't mean anything that it means sort of being sexually deviant today. Over time, that word has evolved. Now that I've said that, does that mean you can go out and feel good about using lewd? Probably not. But many of us are not really familiar with the etymological history of the words that we choose. But once we do become aware of it, it can often change our relationship with those words.
Absolutely, and I do urge you, Bookworm is here to buy Valerie's book, Like Literally Dude, Arguing for the Good in Bad English. You have published this and you get some feedback.
I'm sorry.
You get feedback about this book.
Yes. I have had a lot of feedback about the book, and especially the title.
Yes,
that seems to be a big hit with people. Not to say those words, but those words in terms of understanding their etymological history. And that's really what I'm trying to do in that book, and also in my work more generally. I'm an academic, so most of my research is stuff you don't want to read, or only if you want an early bedtime. But in this book and in my next book, which is about accents, really my goal is to help people understand the science and history of language, because they can be a little better educated and maybe a little more empathetic to some of the changes that are going on in language. I know I haven't convinced you yet, but I'm still working on it, and I think that's really my goal.
And so one of the questions that we've been sort of banding about here is, Are there standards of discourse that we ought to try to conform to, and if we don't, that's an issue? Or is language what it is, and we should, to use maybe one of your terms, chill out over it? And I think that's a really complicated question.
It's a complicated question, and there's no simple answer. And I think that there's not, the extremist position on either side is really not the right way to go. We just have to come up with a happy medium that can satisfy those of us that are, a little bit purists in our hearts, because we were raised with this idea of standard norms and standard language being the correct language, but also understanding that the language that we think of as correct many times 100 years ago was the exact opposite of correct. So how many of you use a progressive verb ever in your life?
Tell us what that is.
A progressive form is ing. So I am walking, I am talking, I am hopping, I am singing, I am jumping, I am chilling.
Well, we all do,
everybody, right? That was a trick question, right? Everybody should be raising your hand. But about 200 years ago, that was actually considered a really colloquial slang usage. And it wasn't considered very couth to use it. And it's only recently, and it's actually led by women's use in colloquial letters and in sort of colloquial informal context, that it became very popular, and as what we call grammaticized, or a grammatical form for meaning something that is progressive tense or ongoing. The big word, grammaticalization, that linguists use. But we use it now every time we mean that, but 200 years ago and before that, we would just either not use a progressive form at all, so the present tense would be used for a progressive action, or we'd indicate it in some other way, like every day I go to the store, which we can still do, but it's not typical. But that's something we would all consider standard today, and yet 200 years ago it wasn't. And even more, how many of you'd say walking versus walkin' is standard? Everybody, right? Now, all of you probably say walk-in sometimes when no one else is looking and everybody else is walking. But the reality is the original form for a progressive type, a participial form in Old English was actually in, not ing. So the correct form is in, and in fact, Jonathan Swift, who I know is a favorite of yours, who was quite the grammar maven, would talk about rhymes and what was a proper rhyming scheme, and he would rhyme ruin with doin', because that was an appropriate rhyme. And he also even wrote that the appropriate form for learning is learnin'. So obviously the norms have changed. We just have a problem changing with it when we can see that change happening in front of us.
But we all draw the line somewhere. So we say walking, talking, birding, which I start to catch a little at that. Journaling drives me crazy. We all have them, right? Everyone commits errors from a certain point of view, and yet they draw the line at something they can't stand to hear. And since you've been here, people have been coming up and confessing to you their pet peeves about language.
Yes, they do. I get a lot of confessions,
yeah,
which is an appropriate place, I think, to be for that. So come on up and confess your sins, your grammar sins. I do. I mean, I'm human. I have pet peeves, and I also have a prescriptivist sort of background.
Wait a minute, you better explain this. So there are two basic schools of this.
Right.
Descriptivists and prescriptivists. Tell us what you mean.
So I'm a descriptivist, which means I explain language as it's actually done. So I look at language, I try to understand how the language that I see and hear before me has occurred. So what are the principles guiding language as it's emitted from everyday people? A prescriptivist is a grammarian or a dictionary writer or an English teacher, someone that tries to tell you the rules for how you should speak rather than maybe describing the rules for how you actually speak. So there's sort of two schools of thought on the types of rules that are important in language. They're the linguistic rules, which is what I study, and those are the cognitive and articulatory rules that make language possible, how we learn language as a baby, how we have disruptions from interference with a second language when we're, first language when we're learning a second language. Those are the types of things that a linguist studies from a descriptive standpoint. But all the people that complain about how language is going to the dogs are taking a prescriptivist stance that assumes there is some pure or correct version of language and that we should all aspire to it. And this is really an 18th century line of thought. It really didn't exist to the degree it does until about the 18th century.
So a prescriptivist believes that there are standards, that there's grammar, that we shouldn't split infinitives, that we shouldn't have dangling modifiers, that we should pronounce words in the way they should be pronounced, that we shouldn't make verbs out of things that are nouns and so on. How many of you will join me in being essentially prescriptivist? Well, that's everybody. That's everybody.
Wait a minute. I saw a lot of the front row not raising their hand. There are a few of them in there.
No, I think most people are descriptivists. How many of you basically think it is what it is?
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's about even.
So interesting that one word you said, I'm going to call out one word, and you said that they believe there should be grammar. And so this is an interesting misconception that the rules of prescriptivist views of this idea of things we write down in Webster's. How many of you ever had that Webster's book for grammar? That was what sure. I had, the usage guide. That those are rules of language. The reality is that all languages have grammar, or we couldn't use them. We can't speak without grammar. There is no such thing as a grammarless language. And whether it's a language that's written down or not matters very little to the fact that it has a grammar or not. A lot of times we equate written language with a grammar and spoken language or non-standard language as being grammarless. But I would want to really argue that that's never a word we should use to say about language that it's grammarless, or one language has a grammar, another one doesn't, because by default, if it is a language, it must have a grammar. The key difference being, does it have the social rules governing its usage? And that's what you're talking about, versus does it follow purely linguistic rules and not, and some social ones, but different social ones than the dominant?
Okay, a couple of things. So here's what you mean by rules. So I say I swim, but we have a grammar, we have a system. So I say yesterday I swam. So these are things that all languages have, because we need to talk about the past, the present, and sometimes the future, right? That's one.
Right.
All right. But how many of you, when you hear somebody say, him and I are going to the mall, cringe? And so, we're stuck in this kind of weird situation, aren't we, where we all have some sense that there should be rules, but we also know that especially spoken language has a kind of its own anarchic
It has a
forms.
life of its own,
Right.
right. Well, and interestingly, with the verb that you chose, this idea of how we indicate past, present, and sometimes future. A lot of languages don't have future tense, and in fact, English doesn't have a future tense. How many people would say, yes, English does? You're wrong. Right now, I'm leaving. So it's interesting, it has a way to express, it has a word that expresses future, but it doesn't actually have future tense. So how do you make a past tense verb? ED. How do you make a future tense verb? Is that an ending? It's not an ending marking tense, so it actually doesn't, we don't have tense. We have a word that encodes future, and that's actually fairly recent in the history of English. The verb will is from willen in Old English. That actually meant to want or desire, because when you want or desire something, when are you wanting it?
Tomorrow.
In the future. And eventually that came to be used for future tense. So, we have different ways of doing it. And so we added something new to English because it was lacking something. And that's really what drives the evolution of language. Just the same reason that wanting something drove us to have a way to actually will it into the future in an encoded word actually led us to change language. And the same thing happens every day when we are missing something, when there's a gap in language. And that doesn't mean it's a gap for everybody, but a gap for a certain group, and that's where we have a lot of contest ideologically. Language will always evolve to meet that need for speakers, and that's the same thing with the you pronoun. When we say you guys, or you all, or y'all, or you'uns, or any of these various forms, it's because there is a lack of a way to denote you plural as distinct from you singular.
There's a lack of this, so we have to find a way.
So we have to find a way, and that's why we get all these different usages, where I can say you guys, or you all, or y'all. These all come to meet a need that we're lacking.
Let's go to just a little outline of what we hope to get to.
Okay,
the time
perfect.
is nearly gone now.
I'll just stop talking.
The paradox, no, it's not you. The paradox of free speech, that's one. You can't say that. Names on the land, I have a particular fascination with this.
We will get to that for sure.
Gender, the whole world of the pronoun in our moment, and the normalization of vulgarity. So we'll get to as many of these as we can. Let's move forward. So let's start with the paradox of free speech, the paradox of the First Amendment. First of all, let me read it, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. That was ratified on December 15th, 1792, the first of the Bill of Rights, the 10 Amendments. And the background of this is quite interesting. When the Constitution was drafted in Philadelphia, there was a lot of resistance, to use a current term, and the Anti-Federalists, as they were called, weren't sure they wanted this new central government, and they made that clear all over the country. And because of that, James Madison, prompted by my hero, Thomas Jefferson, and you'll hear more about that tomorrow night in my vicious debate with Lindsay Chervinsky, my man Thomas Jefferson wrote to Madison and said, there has to be a Bill of Rights. You have to have a plain English declaration of human rights or this Constitution is void. And partly for that reason and partly for others, Madison decided to do it. He gathered potential amendments from around the country, whittled it down to 18. Congress looked at them and 12 were promulgated, 10 were ratified. And the thing about it is that there wasn't a lot of intensive debate about this. The first Congress of the United States had many more important things to do than the Bill of Rights, and so they just kind of sent this through almost as boilerplate. If they had known how essential that document would become in American history, you could be sure they would have debated it a lot. But they didn't, and so we have this very, very strong statement about human rights, and the First Amendment, they're in no particular order, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. All right, but it doesn't quite work that way, does it?
Well, I think we often do have problems with what really free speech is and defining it, and there is no reality behind the idea of free speech because there are different types of constraining and restraining speech. And I think, when you put it into legislative law of this nature, you talk about maybe penalties that are legal, but there are penalties that are social, and I think those are the ones that we're grappling with today. We're not really talking about free speech in the legislative terms today. We're talking about in the social consequences for either canceling someone, which has become very popular, or holding people accountable. And there's this constant struggle between social accountability and this idea of censorship. And I think that's where we find ourselves in discussion today.
And I think you will agree with this slide that the internet and social media have greatly exacerbated the issue.
Absolutely. We wouldn't have this discussion really without the internet. Public shaming has been part of culture forever. And I think in the history of not just American history, but British history, Greek history, Roman times, we had public shaming of different ways. And if you go and you ever have played as a child in any of those scaffolds, where you put your hands in and locked in, those were public shaming devices. The scold's bridle that women had to wear that depressed their tongue. Oh, I think they put a few men in it, but mainly it was women, for talking out of turn or gossip that was evil in forms. That was often a form of keeping people from speaking because what they said was controversial or dangerous. There's been a long history of dangerous talk being relegated into sort of these nebulous categories of what they do to us as a society. But the problem today is that we can advertise these over millions of miles and across millions of people within milliseconds. And that has devastated our ability to have good, decent conversations about the changing meaning of words, the norms that we all want to try to come up with together and work together in a civil society. And also this sort of jump on the bandwagon knee-jerk mentality that you read something, you think, oh, I agree with that, and instantly you join the internet flaming culture.
So some of this can be attributed to technology and the internet. It feels, Valerie, that we're in a particularly volatile time when everyone is walking on eggshells and there's grievance culture in every direction, and if you're not careful, suddenly there's going to be an intense blowback. Your career might even be destroyed. Are we misreading this? Has this always been the case and we're just so much more attuned to it right now, or is there some sort of anxious moment in language, especially in the United States?
Well, there's certainly been cycles of this. It's not the first time that there's been fierce language debate. But I think what's different now is how easy it is to have something you say broadcast into an audience that you didn't intend. And sometimes, in our own groups, we might say things that we wouldn't say in a larger group. And now there's no safety. You never know. I mean, one of you might be secretly putting this on, in the internet somewhere and putting different comments, or even faking my voice. Now, you can do so much with impersonation. There are a lot more dangerous ways that I think we can be misrepresented, or even appropriately represented, but in different groups without the situational context that we often used previously to sort of engage topics, or even maybe say things that were a little bit spicy, but didn't intend those to be removed from the immediate context. And now we have to be very, very careful. I don't think it's something that we're misrepresenting. I think we are all more cautious about what we say and feel this pressure that we have to be very self-censoring in what we say. Whether it's as legitimate a concern as we have made it to be is maybe questionable, because I think the true examples of everyday people that have gotten in deep trouble for what they've said are probably much smaller than the celebrity or political examples that we often hear about. And it's kind of like a shark attack. You hear about them, so it makes you think every time you go in the ocean you're going to be attacked by a shark. It doesn't necessarily mean that the sharks are actually there. So I think we have to be careful to not overreact, but there is reason to react.
But an important distinction that you made is that the First Amendment has very important legal protections and very few prohibitions, although we've all heard you can't shout fire in a public building and you can't incite actions against public figures that involve violence and so on. That we all get it, that there are limits even to the very broad First Amendment, right. But you're also talking about non-legal punitive activities. So we were talking about this yesterday, but you can say, just think of rhyming words. If I say cluck or duck or stuck or muck or truck, no problem. If I use the F word, suddenly there would be people in this room, I think, who would be, oh, I'm sorry he said that. That's not really right. That's inappropriate. We may not come to the next CCI if that's the kind of thing that the Vail Symposium is purveying. So there is that kind of non-legal world of strategizing about what can be said. And I think I speak for myself, but I think I speak for everybody else too. There are places where I'll use the F word, and I think quite effectively, but when I do, I think, was this appropriate? Is this a safe space for that? Have I now lost the respect of people because I'm so lazy that I resort to that, and so on? We all do this, right? We all have groups or situations in which we feel free to speak more freely, and others where we're more cautious. And this is everybody lives in this world.
Everybody does, right. And that's sort of what I was saying, that we have this situational context in which we might say things we wouldn't say in another context, but we feel safe to do it. And now we don't know that we're always safe to do that, because we don't know really what might be broadcast about us, what's going to show up, or if I'm on a hot mic, and if that's being recorded. We're just much more vulnerable to those kinds of problems. But I think what's really the fundamental issue here is that we just don't know anymore what is safe and what's not. So maybe the F word is not the perfect example in this context, because some of these people might be going, yes, I'm coming back because he used that word. We're really shifting in our norms about profanity, and I think it's more about what are words that we can use that don't offend anybody, right? And offend somebody in terms of their group membership. And this is where we're really seeing a splintership into groups in a way that we didn't have before. And the more that we talk about things that divide us, the more divided we become. And I think this is one of the fundamental problems, and one that we certainly experience as college professors a lot, much more than we used to.
So here's a slide. I said the S word, I said the F word, I said Christmas. You wouldn't have thought that saying the word Christmas could be volatile, but in certain circumstances, we know the war against Christmas and how Bill O'Reilly made a career out of that for a significant amount of time. If you would go back to 11, please, James. I chose this, Valerie, because this is how I feel much of the time. This is how I feel we are. You watch MSNBC and Fox, or you look at what's going on the internet, you see what people tweet, or the threads on Facebook, and you're just mystified by the amount of vitriol and rage and grievance and anger and and suspicion and decrying and degrading other that's going on at this time. It feels like we're in a nightmare scenario at times, doesn't it? I don't feel that was true in 1945. I wasn't alive then.
I was going to say, I wasn't. I don't think either of us were there back then. You know, I think one of the things we do is we often have sort of the recency illusion, which is that whatever's happening to us is something very, very different. But you know, if you look back several centuries, in colonial times, there was a lot of animosity. People were not that friendly to each other. And if we go back to the times of Old English, when, you know, in the Anglo-Saxon culture, it was not a very polite culture. I mean, politeness as we know it today did not exist in that culture. And in fact, you would get something called flighting, which was an extremely popular form of heroic verse. Beowulf has a lot of examples of flighting that would be very equivalent to today's internet flaming. The difference being that, you know, that was in verse that maybe two people could read versus the internet is something that we all have access to. So I don't think actually maybe there's less harmony today than there have been at previous times in history when people have been very angry about each other. But it's just different in the ways that we have to let those emotions go viral and react. The other thing is I really have gotten to the point where I cannot read comments in social media feeds, not even to my own stuff. I don't really post much, but you know, I don't read a lot of commentary in those feeds to anybody, because part of the problem with social media is that the thing that keeps us a civil society is contact and solidarity and the interest in being members of a community. But you incorporate the distance of the internet, which makes us basically not know each other and much more willing to say things. It's sort of like when you're driving in a car, you can say that thing about that person that's tailgating you or the person that is too slow, and you'll scream and yell at them, but then you might drive into the same place and you'd be like, oh, hello, how are you doing? You wouldn't say the same things to their face, and then you might even feel bad about having said it. But the internet is impersonal. The internet is distant, and distance is crucial in language because it is the difference between what we say to a stranger versus what we say to those that we care about. What we say to someone we don't know at all, that we don't identify with, and that we might even see as someone that's potentially a threat, versus someone that might help us and cooperate, right, who is sort of in our own group. And that is, I think, fundamentally the problem with the internet and why these small differences get escalated into such big differences.
So there's anonymity. Things I would never say to you, I might say on Facebook, especially if you couldn't identify me.
Right.
From a linguistic point of view, or from a psychological point of view, is this maybe okay? That's catharsis, that people need to vent, and we all vent privately, but maybe this is somehow we let off the steam of living in a very complex culture at a very complex time.
Well, I personally don't think it's okay, right? I don't think incivility is ever okay in those kind of contexts when you're actually hurting someone with your words. Is it okay to maybe be on a Reddit subthread that everybody shares your opinion and vent in that way as a catharsis? Probably. But that's not where we're finding it. And I think if it was just in those contexts, it wouldn't be so problematic. But the problem is, you can go on and say something completely innocuous, and then someone is hating you for this perception they have about you based on, you know, something very simple you said, or maybe nothing you said at all. They're just being hateful, and real damage can happen when we do that kind of thing. So I don't think it's harmless. I don't think insulting people is ever harmless.
Let's go to 23 here. So I want to play a little clip here.
Okay, perfect.
This is one that you all will be able to identify immediately. This is George Carlin in his stand-up routine, and also then we also have a piece of a clip from an appearance he made on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, when Carson was in one of his more serious moods and wanted to talk about the implications of those 7 famous words. So let's play that clip.
You know, that's the trouble with it, is trying to decide what to call these words, man, or trying to decide what to call this whole thing. You know, what are these words that I'm talking about? They're just words that we've sort of decided not to use all the time. That's about the only thing you can really say about them for sure. That they're just some words, not many either, just a few, that we've decided, well, we won't use them all the time. Sometimes, well, hell yeah. Sometimes it's okay, but not all the time. And they're the only words that seem to have that restriction. I mean, there are a lot of words you can say whenever you want, Pneumonia! Nobody gives you a lot of... All right, you can't yell it in the hospital a great deal, but what the hell? There are words that you can say, no problem. Topography! No one has ever gone to jail for screaming topography. But there are some words that you can go to jail for. There are some words that we just have decided we will not say all the time. Sometimes, okay. If you're running through the jungle chasing somebody that we're at war with, you can holler them. If you're shooting a criminal, it's okay. It's the all-American thing.
But what do you think it is? Do you think it's a puritanical upbringing? Do you think it's...
It's habit, I think. We've all agreed these will be the ones that are no good. You bunch over there, 400,000 words in the language, and there's about 9 or 10 that are no good. Over there, we'll say them sometimes. Certain guys can say them to each other, and certain conditions. No just yelling them out. No saying them on the panel. They're just...
Are there places where you wouldn't use those words?
Absolutely.
Personally?
Because a word can be offensive in the context of a sentence or in the context of your mood. If you're a little mad and you don't want to really hurt or scare, you might choose milder words and show your madness with your face.
It's amazing what gets people uptight. Certain words bother certain people, and other words they don't think. Those people say, well, that doesn't bother me. But it's always the people who make the case saying they're out to protect somebody else's morals, never their own.
Right.
They seem to be all right, at least the people who criticize that and say, well, I'm not worried for myself.
What do you think?
Well, I think I love, first of all, that is the best clip in the world. I love that. If you watch the whole thing, if you haven't seen it, it's amazing. And very interesting words that were chosen for the list. And we'll talk a little later, I think, about why those are particularly interesting words. But, I think what Johnny Carson sort of taps into there is sort of this idea that words are offensive to some and not others, but where do we draw that line between this offends me and here are the reasons why it offends me, but I'm protecting the morality of someone else? And I think a lot of what we debate in language issues is sort of this idea of morality and that certain words are more moral than others. And I think with not just obscenity, but also politeness words. So please is a word like that. And this idea that somehow if someone doesn't say please, not only are they impolite from an etiquette standpoint, and they weren't raised right, but also that somehow they have a moral failing. And it's really interesting how this gets conflated as two things, as the same thing, when actually they're very, very different. Am I really immoral if I'm impolite? Am I really immoral if I am using bad words? And that's a whole different discussion from those of the sort of cancel culture perspective of words that might be harmful in ways to keeping the voices of certain non-dominant groups silent. And I do think that those are sort of two different issues that they're talking about there. That's really about profanity and the offensiveness of profanity and sort of the morality tied up with those words. But I think really what we're talking about is who gets to decide what words offend a person or a group, and the power that lies behind those that choose that. And I think what we're really in a struggle today about is not so much the words themselves. We all have, lists of words that bother us. You have, I know, several that you've mentioned already that bother you. But it's how do I know which words are going to be offensive to which people? And this is really where we're in a state of complex societal change, and change is always uncomfortable. And I actually don't think we should fight so hard to be comfortable, but I also don't think we should fight so hard to make people uncomfortable. And I think what we have to do is find the balance between those two.
Let me ask the audience, how many of you have been told in the last 5 or 10 years, usually by a child or grandchild, you can't say that. Oh, you can't, Grandma, you can't say that. My mother was a really good case in point, Valerie, because my daughter is anxiety woke. So she's not so woke as she is frightened she's going to be canceled. She's anxiety woke.
Right.
And my mother was 86 when she died 8 years ago, so she was 2 generations prior. And my daughter would say to her, Grandma, you can't say that. And my mother would fly into a kind of a rage, like, why can't you? And Who decided that? And nobody let me know, and you can't say anything anymore, and you know how you've all been there, right? And then like a week later, my mother would be calmed down, and she would then conform or try to conform, right? But it's when that shaming comes, or the perception that you're being shamed, or that you're being judged, or someone is righteous, or you're being seen as lesser or barbaric, or whatever it is, people really don't like that. And they get a lot of it, and they react. And I think that we're living in a moment now of reaction, and one of the elements of the political reaction of our time is enough of that already. Stop telling us, stop moving the goalpost all the time, and stop telling us what we can't say, and stop shaming us, because we're not bad people.
Right.
We're not bad people. And so you see this, right? This is a real
I absolutely
problem.
see it. It is a real problem. And I think what we're really trying to strike that balance of is being sensitive, right, being culturally sensitive. I don't think there's any person in here who doesn't want to be culturally sensitive. But how do we decide where cultural sensitivity ends and being overly sensitive on an individual level begins, to the point that it actually stifles serious, decent discussion of complex societal issues? And then where we've gotten is, especially with the internet, this really very short form, dismissive, cancel culture kind of approach to, you can't say that, and now that you've said it, let's make sure you lose your job and have no friends and don't ever want to open the internet again. And that's certainly the wrong approach. But just as a professor, I think what I have seen in my 25 years of teaching, I'm not admitting to that from anybody, is that I feel when I walk into a classroom that I have to be so much more cautious about the words I choose and the topics I discuss than I was.
You actually feel this?
I feel this. Now, that doesn't mean it's always wrong. I think probably we said things and did things 25 years ago that anybody would think, oh my gosh, that's totally inappropriate. And I was laughing at the bald clip earlier, because when I was a very young professor, I think I'd been a professor for 2 years, so I was 12, and I had a sample sentence in my syntax class, which is about sentence structure. Syntax is how does the brain kind of set up a system, a hierarchical system for constructing sentences. And I had an example, and it was on auxiliary use, which is yes/no questions. So how is it that we know what verb to move in the auxiliary, which is that moves? So I had an example that said, the man is bald, the man who is bald is running, and then I'd have my students try to decide the rule that would explain which is moves, because it's a different is in both cases, and there has to be one rule that it tells us in our brains which is moves, because we never make mistakes about it. That was my whole goal. Seemed logical. Well, I had a student that wrote me an anonymous note, and this was 20 years ago, saying that he was offended by my use of the word bald.
Because?
In that. He didn't explain that. He just said, she always uses bald in the professor always uses bald. It was in my comments at the end of the year. The professor always uses bald in the examples, and as a bald person, I find it offensive. And it never would have occurred to me that would be offensive at that time. Have I ever used the word bald in a sample sentence since? No. This is the first time in 20 years that I've done it. So here's a case where, it had never occurred to me, and I still think it was a fairly sensitive comment. I don't know that there's sort of, bald groups uniting to
You think it
word.
was too sensitive a comment?
My personal opinion was I haven't heard a lot of chatter about bald as a term, but that's why it was so funny when I saw it there, that it causes offense more broadly, probably because the group that gets bald the most is a group that doesn't tend to have as much of a voice today about complaints along those lines. But it did affect me. It did affect me by someone telling me, look, you did offend me as a person, and I may not be just about it. They didn't try to explain why it offended them, except that they were bald themselves. It did make me more sensitive to them, and I think that's something we all want to do. It wasn't hard for me to come up with a different example. It wasn't. I just use now the man who was tall, and I've never had a tall person complain about that. I think there are ways to be sensitive, and you can even be sensitive to individual wants and desires, but what happens now is you never know what it will be that sets someone
You
off.
cannot know going into that class.
You cannot know. And so, I teach a class called sociolinguistics. And so, you have to talk about gender. You have to talk about ethnicity. I talk about age. We talk about sexuality. These are, and so I used to teach a class called Language and Gender. I will not teach it anymore. I will not teach it. The last time I taught it was such a hotbed of controversy with the students, with each other, that I told my dean that was the last year I will ever teach it, because it has changed so much what I can talk about. And in my traditional language and gender class, it was on male and female language, because that's the field of language and gender, started with male-female gender research, and that's what I was raised with as an academic scholar. That's what I teach. I did open up the floor to discussion about LGBTQ issues, but I don't know that scholarship, so I explained that to my students, that I didn't feel comfortable teaching about that. And, but that is all the students wanted to have the class be about. And so I just said, I can't teach this class anymore because I don't know how to talk that talk.
Well, let's talk about the
problems.
implications of that for a minute. So the idea of the university, the Enlightenment idea of the university, is robust conversation, that some of it is disturbing conversation, that you can only find the truth by a free marketplace of ideas, and that some things that are uncomfortable are going to come up, and so on. If you self-select not to ever teach that class again, then there's a chilling effect on the robustness of discourse, isn't there?
Well, I'm hoping that I teach a different class that actually is just as robust and interesting, but absolutely. But this is a decision many of my colleagues are making, and it's colleagues of a certain age. I have to say that this is truly generational, and I think that as we age out of the academic tower, more and more young professors don't feel the way I do, and they actually do very much feel constrained to talk about certain topics and feel that that's the right way to do it.
To be constrained.
To be very limited in how they discuss an issue.
So you see this slide, and this is a very widely held public perception that we're living in a time now where any professor anywhere can be fired within 48 hours if you say the wrong thing and so on. I think you think that we've made a little too much of this.
Absolutely, and I don't know that it's the idea of being fired. I don't worry about that so much. I mean, I'm also have a rank that doesn't have to worry about it, so I'd probably have to murder a student for them to actually fire me. Well, I'm not going to test it, but I think they could shame me for sure. But we certainly have young professors that are not tenured yet that can be concerned. But I have met very few of our young professors that feel the way I do. In fact, some of our biggest problems have been with some young professors as well, in terms of them not wanting to teach certain things. I review young professors that don't have tenure every year. We, as sort of the more senior colleagues, go in and we sit in on their teaching just to help give advice. But what I have found is they don't want my advice because it is a different set of advice than they would want to teach from. And when I went to observe one of my younger faculty members' classes, she apologized in advance for the students presenting that day because she said basically they weren't very socially aware and she was embarrassed by the presentation. They hadn't presented yet when she told me this. So she was going off what her opinion of these students for not knowing how to discuss issues in a way that she felt was appropriately, I think we'd call it politically correct, that it would be offensive. And I actually listened. I thought they did a very good job at handling a complex topic that was very new to them, and it engendered a great discussion, and that was the opportunity of the professor to then make sure she suggested alternative viewpoints that the student could have considered that she didn't. That was an opportunity versus the limitation that the professor was trying to put on her. So I think it's not just the professors that are on the edge, students are also...
Students are hypersensitive about what comes out of their mouth, and they often won't talk in class now because they're afraid they'll be socially canceled.
I think it works both ways. But there is a certain sensitivity that I do think the students have that they didn't have before, where students feel really emboldened to complain about things that bother them personally, that really it's hard to see how it is a bigger societal problem. Or even students complain about other students that are trying to be very socially aware. So I taught in that class talked about with language and gender. It was during COVID, so it made things were just not good during COVID in professor worlds anyway. But I had a white male grad student who was extremely sensitive, and he was studying, gender and rhetoric. So it wasn't that he wasn't, woke, if you want to use that word at all, but he was in a discussion group on Zoom, because we were on Zoom at the time, and I put the students in discussion groups, and I would hop between them. So obviously I couldn't be in all the groups at once. Well, while I wasn't in that group, the grad student told the other one, sort of that he was aware of his white privilege, that he was aware of his white male privilege, and it made him very uncomfortable. And that, he really felt like he was trying to work really hard at making amends for the wrongs that white men had done, which I think was he was trying to really suggest that he wanted to be open to hearing different viewpoints. And this, remember, was in a context of language and gender. Well, there was a student in the class that was an ethnic student, and she contacted me after class because she wanted me to expel that student from the class because he had used the word white male privilege in front of her, drawing attention to her ethnicity.
Whoa.
So
it's kind of an oh come on moment.
So that was the moment where I realized this. And I brought her into the class, my office, and I said, listen, I understand that was offensive to you, and I want to try to understand why it was offensive to you. And I said, I'm absolutely sure that the student didn't mean to offend you, and in fact, I think he was trying to be sensitive to the fact that it had nothing to do with you, but to the topic of the class. That the topic of the class was on language and gender, and we talk a lot about the imbalance in language in terms of slanting it towards the male perspective, and really that was what he was referencing. And she actually complained to my chair that I didn't take her belief seriously.
That even though you carefully tried to explain what had happened, the dynamics.
Right, and so this
situation.
is what I'm sad about. It's the loss of having the ability to have a conversation about what bothers you.
How serious is this issue? Because I know lots of people that just think, what's going to happen to us? We're afraid of everything now. I mean, we can be offended at any moment by anything. There's no way there are no maps. There's no way of knowing what's coming, and it just makes you want to tune out because you feel that it's just such a dangerous thing to try to be candid.
Well, I think it is a serious issue, but I also think there's a danger of being dismissive when we do that, because I think we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. I'm apologizing to all babies everywhere.
Anti-baby. How dare you?
Exactly.
How dare you? And what about that bathwater?
I know, the poor bathwater. I think we have to be careful, because certainly we have grown a lot as a society in terms of what we are able to say. So, one example is certain words that I used to use as a teenager. I remember we would easily say, oh, that's so gay. How many of you ever said that expression? And now you're thinking, oh my gosh, how did I say that? It sounds so horrible today. And we only become aware like that when we have ideological struggle about it, when we have discussions about it, when we have people call us out for it, and we're made more aware. So I also don't want to make light of the fact that people are overreacting to linguistic injustice, because it does exist. But where we are is where we've gone so extreme to the other side that I think it has made people then be much more, nothing I say is right, and maybe they're not engaging with that conversation as much as they should in the ways that it actually might be helpful rather than harmful. Which is why then I think we've had this sort of pendulum swing. Which we see in I think the election of Trump and the election of sort of this much more conservative agenda, that people that might not necessarily agree with all of Trump's political leanings do feel that some of the way he's articulated differences of opinion with maybe the progressive left on some of those more, progressive social issues, and the idea of political correctness, and the idea of trans language and trans rights that have been at contest. I think people there might have felt, okay, we've gone so far over where I can't even say the word woman anymore, or I can't use the word biological sex, and that's maybe an extreme stance that we've seen more and more discussed. And whenever we see extremes on one end, it sort of awakens the extremes on the other, and that's what brings us into balance. So I do think what we're doing now is politics aside, no matter what you think, it doesn't have anything to do with who's president, but with our own national psyche, we're coming to a reckoning of where that balance is between what is truly culturally sensitive and what's just maybe being overly sensitive as an individual.
So about 18 months ago, former President Obama spoke about this and said something that I thought was really superb. He said, look, we're going to have to be more forgiving of each other. Not everyone is aware of these changes. We need to bring people along gracefully. We need to be generous in the way we respond. The righteousness is not helping our national unity or our national discourse. We all need to calm down a little bit about this, and we need to be much more forgiving of perceived violations of political correctness. He said this tendency that where everyone's always upset all the time does this country no good in the long run. And I thought right on that a very important man that you can't dismiss, who has walked the walk, and believe me, he has known what aggressive language can be. He went out on a limb and got a lot of pushback from the left for saying this. But he said, come on, shall we chill out a little bit, folks? And I think he was right, don't you?
I do. I think, and he's actually many times spoken on these types of issues. And he certainly has been the victim of very culturally insensitive language before. In fact, there's really interesting quotes, and I'm not going to bring them up because I don't want to get into the politics of it all, but where basically when he was first running for president, people said, really, if you read them now, it is shocking what some people said, but basically claiming that he was the first clean, nice-looking, articulate.
That was Joe Biden.
I wasn't going to bring that up.
That was Joe Biden. He's a black man we can deal with.
Yes, and so, and that wasn't that long ago. So I think what I really want to make clear in this discussion is these are serious issues facing us. Language is significantly important in the way that we construct our relationships and our power balances. And we should not ignore that. But we also don't want to feel like we, A, can't have discussions about them, and B, can't say anything, because then that just stifles the whole idea behind democratic agreement, which is what we have to come to in deciding what language we want to use to be inclusive.
Let me give you an example when it's done right. So I was interviewing a distinguished African-American scholar, and we had been about 40 minutes and we're having a great conversation. And I said, President Obama didn't play the race card very often. And there was a hesitation, and she said, okay, maybe you want to think again about using the word race card, because it sounds like a poker game, or maybe that could be perceived in some quarters as trivializing this essential issue in American life of race. And she said, I'm not offended, but you might just want to think about that, because the metaphor that's hidden there that you never, you didn't think about the metaphor when you said it, you were just saying something, that in certain circumstances that might be perceived as hurtful or offensive. And I was so appreciative of that, because she didn't say, this is the end of this interview, you're obviously a racist, how dare you this?
Or finish the interview and post something about you on social media.
Well, she may have, I don't know. But you take my point that this is what Obama's asking us to do. President Obama, he's saying, let's bring each other along here. And let's be tolerant, and let's be forgiving, and let's not assume that everyone has been a student at Columbia or Brown or Yale, that there are 340 million Americans at various stages on all of these questions, right?
Absolutely. And I think that's really what's important is that we don't have a problem with being uncomfortable in doing that. And that's really where, we have to be able to talk to each other. And we have to be able to not be so knee-jerk in our reactivity about being called out for things that we say that might be offensive to someone else. It doesn't mean we're always going to agree with them. I think that's the other important thing. Because someone's offended by what we say doesn't always mean that they had maybe, in my own view, the right to be offended about that. It also doesn't mean I had the right to say it. I think we have to negotiate that. And so to understand why, how power plays into it. So I think one thing we really need to also think about is sort of the idea of mainstream values and dominant culture, and how that really has controlled public discourse for centuries. And part of our discomfort is not only with how extreme things have gotten, but it's who's having more a seat at the table. And I think there is some discomfort in trying to reevaluate how we've thought about society and who makes up that society that this conversation about inclusive language brings up. And we think about, oh, these are small groups, and they're leading the agenda, these small groups that make up 5% of the population, when, why doesn't the 50% population have the dominant value?
Who gets to decide what I can say?
Who gets to decide? And so I think, yes, you can take that argument that whoever makes up the majority gets to choose, but that's really how history has dealt most of the time, both our linguistic choices, our place names, our government. All of those things have always been decided by the dominant majority, and what's really shifted in the last 20 years or so is who is getting a seat at that table to have conversations about that kind of language. And that itself is really important, and I don't think we want to exclude them.
We got to move forward, but I just want to spend 3 minutes on the F word. Because you said something very interesting in a private conversation about this. Why is the F word so incredibly powerful? Because we all have moments of exasperation. Can you do the cartoon of Santa? The Santa. There, Santa said the F word, Santa said the F word. Santa's stuck in the chimney, right? So all of us, Valerie, have these moments when something has gone wrong. And some exasperation needs to come out of us. And the F word is a very convenient one these days, but there are others.
There are others. And first of all, I just have to say I'm really appreciating the butt crack part of that whole comic, because it really adds to the ambiance. Curse words in general are very useful, and they are processed differently when we look at where swear words are processed in the brain. The ones that are exclamations, usually of pain or
for Christ's sake,
emotion. When you hit your finger with the hammer, those kinds of things. Those are actually processed in the limbic system.
That's not the same thing.
Not the same thing as where language is processed. So they actually seem to be processed differently. And that's a little different than using it as a solidarity word, where it actually does seem to be processed as language. But there is something very primitive and primordial about uttering obscenity in certain contexts for that socio-emotional cathartic release. Studies tell us that actually there is a catharsis when we use them, and which is why all of us do, at least privately somewhere, and maybe it's gosh darn instead of the F word, but it has that same effect of being cathartic. It also increases your pain threshold. Right, so
you have a
higher tolerance for pain. So they've done experiments.
That's why Santa said it.
Right, exactly. And he still didn't get through there, but it actually makes you more powerful. So maybe saying the F word helps him push himself through this chimney. So they had really interesting experiments where either they had someone hold their hand in ice water for as long as they possibly could, and then they would have another group hold their hand in ice water, or actually it was the same, I think they did it with the same participants, and they'd have them say the F word over and over and over again, and they held their hand in there longer when they were uttering obscenities.
Really? So but the F word, our F word, also has a particular way that it's formed in the palate and so on. What's that about?
Not just the F word, but if you think of the 7 words that you cannot say on television, all of them take the form of using what linguists call stops or fricatives. Of course, they have vowels because you can't have words without vowels, but the stops and the fricatives are explosive. So think about a word like put. And if you say that, it feels explosive. You can just feel your mouth. The air comes rushing out. And we call them plosives.
Use it in a sentence.
I am going to hit that putt. Or what, a putt. What is a putt? Isn't a putt this? Yeah, okay, I don't golf, so I'm like, how do I use putt?
There are limits.
Okay, you caught me, I don't play golf. I knew it was a golf word. You can use that one in a sentence.
But if I say somebody is a putz, same thing. That this is...
Yes, although then it has sort of the TZ, but yes, it is. All right, let me use an example, and I'm not going to close your ears if this is going to offend you. Piss or shit. Those both have explosive sounds, right? The P, the S. So it's also fricativized. The S is a fricative, so right? It feels kind of violent and abusive. And if you look at cuss words, they almost always have this phonetic makeup of using plosives or fricatives because there are harsh sounding words. And interestingly, when we look at languages that we think are very melodious, so like Italian tends to use a lot of vowels. It's very sonorant, which means it has a lot of R's, it has a lot of L's, it has a lot of M's, it has N's, it has vowels. Sing it, you can flow, it's very sexy. But then if you have a language like German, ich bin krank, it comes across as harsh because it uses a lot of plosives. And guess what cuss words do? They use a lot of plosives. So they also embody physically this idea of forcefulness and power.
All right, let's go to names on the land. We're running out of time.
Okay, yes, let's talk faster about
very
names.
very interesting that different sectors of the brain are responding when you use one of those.
When you use it in a cathartic sense.
Right.
When I'm saying,
exasperation.
When I'm saying it in a different context, like just to hang out and, that's some cool shit.
What the
F
F are you
like
doing
that.
here?
Then
Yeah.
it's processed where language is processed.
People do understand that intuitively, that these words can be relatively harmless in a certain situation by tone, by humor, by body language, and so on, by the ethos of the group. Whereas if you say, I am not taking this
it's very
any
right,
longer,
and it refers to, and or just like when you hit yourself with something, you say, oh shit, it's expressive, it's emotional, and the whole point of doing that is to be cathartic, to allow that emotional intensity to come out. But when I say, that's some damn shit, brother, that's a totally
You're getting
different
into
kind
it
of
now. We got to
emotions.
stop you here.
Okay.
You're getting into it. I want to show a couple slides here. So
All right, let's do it.
This is really important to me, and we're seeing it in the news, of course. This is Mount Denali, then it was our highest mountain, this magnificent, more than 20,000 foot peak in Alaska. Next slide. President Obama, by executive order, which is not in the Constitution, by the way, renamed it Denali, which is an Aboriginal and Indigenous term. There was some consternation about that, but not a lot. It wasn't as volatile as some of these things can be.
Right.
Perhaps because it's so far off for most of us, but nevertheless, and we're in a mood these days to be more sensitive to indigenous names and so on. President Trump, in one of his first executive orders, changed it back to Mount McKinley and did it in a kind of aggressive way, like I'm reclaiming this country.
American greatness, I think, was
Right.
the words he used. Yeah.
Next slide. This is, there he's explaining it. He's explaining his philosophy of this, and I'm sorry to say that is the governor of my home state, Doug Burgum, now the Secretary of Interior, who knows better. But there he is with his wife, and he then tweeted that this is a great moment for America to rename the Gulf of America. Next slide. I love this one. This is one of my favorite. Cartoons are so cathartic. You remember the Sharpie incident with the hurricane, and here he is, not with the Sharpie this time, with the broad brush, making the Gulf of America great again. Fort Bragg had been changed by Congress to Fort Liberty, the largest military installation in the country, named for a Confederate general. He then has changed it back to Fort Bragg, and the Secretary of Defense made it up an absurd story that it wasn't about the Confederate Bragg, it was about a World War I private who had done important things, and nobody believed that, not even the person who said it. Let's go further here. We all know this issue. The S word, I don't even like to say it, is an Algonquin word that it basically talks about a woman as her sexual part. And so if you think of the disgusting slang where someone would say, well, she's my piece, it's the same thing. It's she's my vagina, essentially. I own her sexually. And so it's been removed almost everywhere. But not everywhere, and I know recently, not so recently, but not so long ago here, Squaw Creek was changed to something else, Colero, and that created its own controversy because the Ute leader, Colero, was a Southern Ute and had never been here in this location. And one of the things, let's go on, because I'll explain it a little better. So this is, of course, the famous case, Washington Redskins. now the Commanders, which I think is an even dumber name in some ways, but still, at least it's less offensive.
Right, right.
And so, but there still are the Atlanta Braves and lots of icons that continue down this way. This is all over the country, but this is a sign of some progress in these areas. Let's go ahead. Now this gets into something I'm really interested in. You're talking a little bit about, Valerie. So this is the former Harney Peak in South Dakota, the highest peak between the Rockies and the Pyrenees in the Black Hills, named for an Indian fighter named Harney, as so many places in the American West are, all the places named Custer and Miles and so on. It was changed to Black Elk Peak because the Lakota prophet and seer Black Elk had his vision of a unified world on the top of that peak when he was a young man. And so the name was changed from Harney Peak to Black Elk Peak. But amazingly, and I think this might have been true with the case of Squaw Creek here, the Lakota were not consulted. And so people who felt that this was a travesty, that it should be named Harney Peak, changed it to Black Elk Peak, and then the Lakota, in a careful way, said, look, might have been good if we'd been at the table, because we don't name places for individuals. We don't say Red Cloud Mountain or Crazy Horse River. That's not our style. That's not how our language works. That's not how we commemorate, or that's not an honorific. If you had consulted us, we probably would not have recommended Black Elk Peak. We're not offended by it, but really, shouldn't we have been at the table?
Right.
Right.
I mean, it's so ridiculous if they weren't. But Mount Everest, which was named for George Everest, has an indigenous name, and even Everest, Sagamotha, I think is the name.
Hard.
See, there you go. That's what my linguistics training gets you. But Everest himself did not support having the mountain named after him. He thought it should be an indigenous name, but certainly we weren't putting indigenous people at the table with that discussion either. I don't think that's uncommon. What's uncommon in that context is to try to be culturally sensitive while also being culturally insensitive at the same time.
Or at least somewhat culturally insensitive.
Right. And I mean, I think the intentions were good, and that is really partway there. The interesting thing about naming, and I think with Denali it's a little tricky because the state of Alaska actually renamed it to Denali in 1975. So it had long been Denali. So it's not like it recently was changed. Obama is not the one that changed that. He's the one that had it nationally
officially changed.
That officially changed it in this,
for the U.S.
For the U.S. In Alaska, it was already officially changed. So I think it's a little more complex than people have made it out to be like, oh, it was just Obama. It wasn't. It actually was the state itself. And I think there's a big part of identity and the right to name your own state and things in your state that's also playing into this that has been usurped here, and that's a totally other issue. But the idea of place names having no meaning to the people that name them is an asinine thought, because place names always reveal something about the people who named them. And that was a perfect example that you just gave, because the people that named them, it revealed themselves to be not aware of the traditions of the indigenous group
of the people they were trying to honor by changing the name.
And so what it did reveal is that they were trying to be sensitive to the fact that an indigenous name would be more appropriate in that context, and they were really trying to do the right thing, but they did it in the wrong way, or in a way that could have been better. So it says something about them. But a lot of times when we look at the way that names happen during colonialization, during nation building, territorialization, which is really a lot of what we're seeing here, right?
Let's go to the next slide.
For nationalism. These are the way that names have been put into place for centuries, if not millennia. So there's really nothing new that Trump is doing here, and it's something that has happened over and over with regime change. So when Burma became Myanmar, Bombay became Mumbai, these were all done for very similar reasons. A lot of those were done to recognize different ethnicities. A lot of them were sort of hand in hand with political change. So I don't think that that's really that unique to what Trump's doing, nor is, in the world of history, maybe not even that problematic from the perspective of what is trying to be attempted with that. I think there's a maliciousness sometimes in the way that it's being done here that's unusual. Although, I think often new leaders are pretty malicious to old regimes and the things they supported. But I think what we really have to think about with place names is who's got the power
Who has
to
the
name.
power to name.
And it
So
comes
let's
back
just
to power, which is where we started.
Let's look at a couple more. So Mount Evans, you all know this story. Governor Evans was actually endorsed the Sand Creek Massacre, which is one of the truly tragic, horrible events in the history of the United States, 1864. Cheyenne people living under a flag of truce, attacked by a militia from Denver, massacring women and children on purpose. In fact, some of their body parts were, their sexual body parts were cut off and displayed at the Opera House in Denver to great applause. I mean, this is one of the shameful, unambiguously shameful moments in American history of white-native relations. And so Governor Evans has a mountain. It's now been changed to Mount Blue Sky, right? And so some people are offended by that, but that seems to kind of make a kind of sense. Go to the next one. This one really appeals to me. Some of you have been to the Pueblo village, Acoma, one of the greatest places in America, just unbelievable. Show the next slide. There it is.
Oh, wow.
And they had this, this village here, and go back now to Mount Taylor. You see it in the distance, right there. It's sacred to the Pueblo. It's also sacred to the Diné, the Navajo. And it was named for Zachary Taylor, President Zachary Taylor, who was an Indian fighter, who was engaged in events that are now regarded as massacres. So when I was at Acoma, go back to the plateau for a moment, to the mesa. I was there this year on my Steinbeck trip, and you go there and you get you buy a ticket, and then a person from the village takes you up. You don't go up alone, and told us the story. So when the big structures, especially the church, were built there in the 17th century, the Pueblo and people who did it went this 27 miles to Mount Taylor to get the timber for it, because there was no local timber. And because this was being done in a sacred manner, once they cut the trees, they carried them all the way back to this Pueblo without ever letting those logs touch the ground. So imagine this, just imagine this. And so this is really, really, really important to them. And to think that it's named for Zachary Taylor seems to me just plain wrong, right? There's some that there's kind of slam dunk ones, right?
Right.
And so you know the cultural politics of this is very dense. And there's resistance, there's conservative resistance, even by people who don't know who Zachary Taylor was, right?
Well, I think it's easier to be resistant when you don't know who he was. That's reality. A lot of times we get very tied to what a place name means to us and what a place name means to our own identity as a culture. And that's what we're at war with when we get upset about renaming practices. A lot of times when you do hear a history, and especially when the cases are so slam dunk and obvious, it's much easier to let go of those names. But when we look at naming practices, most of the time when we have colonial nations, they come in and they rename. That's one of the first things they do. And they do it for many reasons. One is to stake a claim, right? One is when you rename, you take power. You have that power to call it what you want, and that makes a claim on its own. But we also name it after things that meant something to us, after people we want to say were important to our history. We often do names that after people that gave us the grants to the land. So Charlestown, which is Charleston, is an example where it was named after a king. We also have Washington, D.C., named after a president. Of course, there's McKinley. So we often sort of pay homage to people that were important to our history with those names. So we have a connection to names, too, when we get these feelings that we're objecting to a new name, as well as those of us that are tied to the land in ways that, were maybe predecessors to the colonial nations. So it's not that there is, one name that necessarily automatically feels right to everybody. So I think that it's normal to have these conversations about who has the right to do the naming. Unfortunately, it's often the case, though, that when we come in and we destroy what was there before, the names that have been adopted are ones that were significant players in a really nasty history. And is that really who we want representing us in these new lands? So I think when we learn those histories, we can often make better informed decisions. But part of the problem is the internet, again, and the ways that these pieces of information get disseminated, where these discussions are not taking place. So, you gave a perfect example where people that don't even know who he was. Once you know who he was, it's more offensive.
It's a little easier.
Right.
And just to add one bit to that, he was also a slaveholder, had scores of slaves, and fought in the Mexican War, which was a war that we now cringe to think about from the middle of the 19th century. So that one may happen, and it would be so pleasing to the people of Acoma, and it wouldn't really damage me at all, right? I don't think that Zachary Taylor's family is lobbying to keep that mountain for him. So I think we're moving in generally speaking, in the right direction on this, and I think the current backlash is inevitable, but it will pass through the culture, don't you think?
I think it will. I mean, all these names, a lot of times things have gotten renamed throughout the last several centuries, and people get used to it. If you look at in other cultures, so for example, the name Oslo, I think we had talked about this before, that's a fairly recent name, but it's a renaming.
The capital of Norway.
The capital of Norway after a medieval name. So the medieval name was actually Oslo, but then it became ruled by a Danish king, and of course, it was Norway, not right. It wasn't Danish. So then he named it Christiana, or it was named Christiana after the king, a Danish king. So when it went back to Norway, to Norwegian leadership, they renamed it to the medieval name to reclaim Norwegian identity.
Their own heritage.
But it was met with fierce resistance.
By Norwegians. So, you're going to see this, but how many people debate Oslo as an okay name today? Or, Constantinople became Istanbul because they were trying to move away from Latin names and the Ottoman Empire, distancing themselves from that and take up a Turkic name. So, these kinds of renamings just take a while to get used to, but they're not at all uncommon in the historical record. I do want to say one thing, though, about the word squaw. It actually is not what the word that was for a long time believed to be. Do you think that's not so anymore?
It's actually not.
What is it?
It's an Algonquin word, but it's iskew was the word that we think it comes from. There are actually cognates in many other languages that are similar to that, which meant young woman.
Mm.
So the word itself didn't have the offensive history origin that we often thought.
So why have we decided we can't
Because
do it?
in 19th century frontier writing, it was used by white explorers and frontiersmen in very, very degrading ways to basically only describe Native American women in very derogatory terms as essentially dirty whores.
Right.
And that really, it's like if we had a mountain called White Dirty Whore. No one would go there, and you would certainly want that to be changed. So that is why it's offensive.
Let's go to the vulgarization just for a minute. We're going to go to questions. So I hope you all have questions, and they'll be coming in on the chat and so on. But so I guess a kind of closing question for our more formal discussion here is how concerned we should be. Because when I was a young boy, these words like the S word and the F word and so on were not used. The F word has been heavily normalized. The C word is becoming normalized. A lot of us feel that there's been kind of a slippage, a vulgarization, a degradation of decorum and proper usage and so on. I think your view is chill out. This has always been the case, and we're making too much of this.
Well, I think I have a modified chill-out view on this. First, let's talk a little bit about what evidence we have for the fact that these words are actually more prevalent, because it's actually not as simple as we might think. It feels like it. How many of you would say it feels like profanity, obscenity is everywhere today? It's much more frequent than when you were a kid. So it certainly feels that way. The question is, what proof do we have that that's actually the case, and what is the form that it takes? If we actually look at studies that look at spoken word corpora or collections of conversations, it's really hard to find enough of that from older eras to do a really good contrast between what people today say and what people 50 years ago said, because we don't tend to record. Well, now we do. Okay, you have TikTok. We would have great data if we were taking today as our earlier time point. But 50 years ago, we didn't have that resource. And how many collections of spontaneous spoken conversations at the level we need to have to analyze data exist from those earlier periods that would be comparable. We don't have much. So it's actually harder than you think to figure out if we've really increased our use. The studies that have looked at that in the existence of corpora that are a little more recent, so they usually take studies from the 1990s to today, have not found that it has actually changed in spoken language. So has it changed in terms of which words we're using? Yes. And has the F word dramatically increased? Absolutely. So in a really interesting study done in Britain that looked at a spoken national corpus that was recorded in 1994 and one recorded in the 2010s, they found that the F word had become much more frequent. It was the most common word, actually, overtaking bloody, which had been the most frequent. And bloody was actually quite an offensive word in Britain. It doesn't sound it to us, but it is. And so it has increased in prevalence of particular words, but the overall rate of swearing decreased. Not by a statistically significant percentage, it wasn't a huge amount, but it actually had decreased. It might have been an artifact of the data collection procedures though, because the people in the 2000s actually knew they were being recorded. The 1990s didn't, and that might make them be more self-aware. But in a similar study done in the United States, it also didn't find an increase in use. So whether we're actually using them more is really unclear, but we're hearing them more, and that is absolutely clear. Because when we look at studies done on books and increases in the use of swear words and obscenity in books over a 90-year period, or movies over a 90-year period, we absolutely see an incredible rise in the use of these. In fact, a study on Google Books found that it was a 30-fold increase in the amount of swear words used. It's a little harder with television motion pictures because while it also has been a huge increase in obscenity, there's regulatory issues, right? The Hays Code, which was enacted, was really active in the early phases of motion pictures, that got replaced in the 1960s with the PG rating code, so that then you could have words in certain movies that were not allowed in any movies prior to that, and that is exactly when we start seeing this uptick, is as you change this rating from the Hays Code, which didn't allow obscenity at all, to this sort of stepped up version where R-rated movies could have it. So there is certainly an increase in what we're hearing, but there's not a lot of proof that there's actually an increase in what we're saying, except in the words that we're choosing. And that's because of something called semantic bleaching, which is a big fancy word to say they don't mean what they used to. And so for those of us that were raised when they did mean what they used to, it sounds really bad. But like the C word is another example, the F word for sure. When we look at how it's used today, so what's really interesting is to look at not only the frequency at which those words are used, but the purpose to which they're used. What we find is in early mentions of the F word, going from the 13th century is actually when we first start seeing that word written, but fairly infrequently, which suggests that it was considered a bad word at that time and wasn't written.
In fact, least in print or in manuscripts.
In print, right. And actually one of the early versions, I told you this story earlier, and I think there was a great picture.
Can you go back to the monk?
Go back to the monk. So what's really fascinating about that picture, one of the really early forms of the F word that was found was actually in a case where it was a scribe, an ecclesiastical scribe, and I think it was 1528, that had written in the margins of a religious text, effing abbot. And actually they had written OD, effing abbot. They didn't say effing, they actually said the word. And they think OD meant old damned effing abbot. And that abbot had quite the reputation as being a fornicating abbot. So that was actually one of the earliest references to that word.
In print or in
print.
script.
And that actually meant fornication. But when we look at how the word effing is used today, it is the infrequent use to actually use it to describe fornication. Instead, we usually use it in emphatic context where it has been bleached of its original meaning, has nothing to do, I had a really effing bad day, has nothing to do with fornication.
We need to go to Q&A.
Okay.
So a lot of people use the wrong context, use the wrong tense, use double negatives. And these are people that are on television or are trying to espouse, their points of view, and underneath it, they're really intelligent if you listen to them. Mm-hmm. But if you hear the double negative or you hear the wrong tense, you turn them off. And it's going to be a hard solution to that. And that solution is K through 12, and I don't know, I mean, it'll be a long time changing it, or it's not going to get changed. What do you think?
So we want prescriptivism to return.
Okay, this is going to be hard to have a short answer to that question. First, let me say that you are certainly not alone in feeling that way. But I think the bigger question is, aside from the fact that you have a sort of knee-jerk reaction that says, oh, this person sounds stupid, they sound uneducated, do you understand what their intention is? You understand their meaning. It's simply you don't like the forms they're saying it in. And so I think what I would say to that is, yes, I think there is a difference in what kids are learning in school today. Let's hope that they're learning to think, but that's very different than learning to speak prescriptively. Thinking and speaking in standard forms have no link. There's no proof that there's a link between them at all. Does it correlate with educational status? Sure. In terms of, if you go to a certain school in a certain neighborhood, you will speak standardly much more likely than if you go to a similar school in a different neighborhood where non-standard English is much more widely spoken, not only by pupils, but by teachers that teach in those areas as well. But does that mean you're not actually able to construct really complex thought? There's zero proof of that, and in fact, there's a really beautiful article written by the recently passed sociolinguist Bill LeBove called The Logic of Non-Standard English. And it is one of the most valuable papers. It is incredible, his analysis of how logical non-standard English actually is, in many ways more logical than the very, very flowery language that we use that's much more vague and hard to decipher. But also the thing is, the certain things that we dislike the most are often relatively recent as being bad forms. So multiple negation is one of those forms that people hate. How many people here use multiple negation?
We all do at times.
Not probably very frequently.
Yeah, define it.
Okay, multiple negation is I didn't do nothing. I'm betting not many of you walk around saying, yeah, I didn't do nothing. What did you do today? Right? You don't say that. It's actually considered a sort of shibboleth of low-class African-American English. But actually, multiple negation was considered correct until the 17th century. It's not till the 17th century that it actually was lost in English. So these are things that just change over time. And there's nothing inherently illogical about it, even though we have this lovely expression, two negatives make a positive, or, what is it? The
Give
expression.
It up, just
yeah, one of those things. I don't even know the prescriptivist saying. But the other thing is, ax for ask is also, we can find that in Chaucer. It's an older form. It's called metathesis, the process that switches two sounds together. And since it's almost April 15th, the word tax and the word task are actually metasized forms of each other. They were the same root. And tax was to pay in money. Task became a metasized form of that same word where the sounds switched, and so it became used for a different context to mean to pay with labor.
Okay, we're going to take another question here, but before we do, I just want to say when you go away tonight, I urge everyone to have a conversation about this. So I think we all are a little confused about some of this, that I think what this man said is very widely held. That if I hear somebody splitting an infinitive, that the tiny little catch in my throat. If I hear somebody using a double negative, that's bigger. If I hear somebody saying him and I, that's more. And I think that we lose respect, that it allows us to characterize, and that we expect that people who have risen to a certain level of professionalism will speak a standard form of English, and when we don't see it, we are likely to judge. And I don't think that, I think many people are going to resist your view that it is what it is, and if you go historically, you see that these things have always been a jumble. I think many people are like, no, there needs to be standards, and it's not unfair to want to advocate for them.
Well, and I think there's a difference between saying that maybe in a professional context that I would want to hire someone that uses standard English in certain jobs. I think there are linguists that would argue that that's not appropriate, but I'm not one of them,
Right.
because I think that we also have to live in a world where standard English does receive a lot more respect and prestige than non-standard English. But I think my answer is simply that we want to be careful about conflating intelligence and speech.
Okay,
because
absolutely.
non-standard language is also intelligent.
Absolutely, all right. And I might say, I didn't do nothing myself, as it's a fun form of
Right,
slang.
but you
in
don't use it
certain-
as part
I
of
wouldn't
your
use it on
It's
television.
not part of your lingo.
Right.
So even though it's in the title of your book, what about like and you know?
No one likes like. I can tell you I've learned that on my travels and talks on this book. And that is actually the word that inspired the book, because I would go and talk public, give public talks and talk about, very esoteric topics about language. And every single time there was someone in the audience that was like, okay, that's great, but tell me why people use like all the time, because it drives me crazy. And that's a very commonly held opinion. So I thought, well, let me do a little research on like, because I think a lot of times the history of usage can be really illuminating, and understanding where it comes from and why it's used, and who we're dismissing using it. And it doesn't mean you have to like it, but it does maybe help you empathize with its use. And the history of like is fascinating. We do see it used as early as the 17th century, which means it was probably used earlier than that, but we see trial transcripts from the Old Bailey proceedings, which are a British legal transcription from the Old Bailey, where trials took place. And that's rare that we have spontaneous speech recorded that early. So if we're finding it in a transcript at trial, we probably would have found it several centuries before. It's very prominent in elderly New Zealanders and elderly rural British villagers, in recordings that were done around the 1950s, which suggests that it was prevalent there in the late 1800s. And very much like we hear it in the Valley Girls speak today. So the idea that Valley Girls somehow invented like is actually completely wrong. It pre-existed Valley Girls by centuries. But what's interesting about it is there are so many functions of like, that someone that uses all of them, which is a lot of times people under the age of 25 that might use all these different forms, sound like they're using like all the time. But what we don't get when we're not doing some sort of more nuanced analysis of how it's being used, is that they're using them in very different contexts. So there's the approximator like, and that's used instead of about. So I would say he's like 25 pounds, where traditionally I might say he's about 25 pounds. And there's a very sharp cutoff in age between who uses about in that context and who uses like. Young people don't use about in those contexts very much at all anymore. Older speakers tend to really lean on about. So that's a one-to-one switch. There's nothing uncertain about it. It's just that it is used instead of about. You also see the sentential like, where it's at the beginning of a sentence. So you might say something such as, I don't think much about it. Like, I've not really decided, maybe I'll go. That's actually the type of like we find most commonly used in early rural British dialects, is that sentence leading edge, and it seems to be a discourse particle that connects what you're about to say to what you were just saying. So I'm continuing on with my train of thought to what I said before. Then the other one which really bothers people, and it's probably the fastest growing use, is the quotative like, which is where it's used instead of the verb to say. And that's where I would say something like, he was like, I don't think I'm gonna go. And I was like, yeah, I think you should go. And that's the one that we really associate with Valley Girls, and that is a very, very new use of the verb to like. But when you're a user that uses all three of those, can you see how it would feel like? There's like, people say like all the time. But the association of like with young women is really where it gets super problematic, because A, evidence doesn't suggest that it is just young women. Young men use like at about equal amounts today. B, young women are actually the typical innovators in language change, and we see this all the way back to the 16th and 17th centuries in women's colloquial writings, that they tended to lead in some of the more colloquial forms of language that then became standard. And so like the use of you, where a ye should be, that was women that led that. And how many of you say ye anymore? Exactly. But women actually, if you look at transcripts from 20 to 30 years ago, it was young women using like the most.
So we need to move to the next.
Okay, sorry. So it is really an innovative use of language by women.
And I want to apologize to Valley Girls everywhere.
For ever accusing
for your slur.
It's really just like an appreciation and a little complaint. I agree with everything you've said. It's just wonderful to hear you speak. Thank you. I say the F word all the time. I love the C word. I identify with it hard. And so everything you've said has been great. But everything changes. Like whenever I think that the world's about to end, I remind myself that every generation thinks that the world is about to end to try and calm myself down. And so all the complaints that I am hearing are the common ones that I'm like fighting against with my own personal use of the F word constantly. But I now am getting older, and so I have come across honestly and literally. And it drives me insane. So I just want to apologize to everyone who I've been driving nuts with my language for the past 20 years. And you have to know that I will be tortured as well as I age.
So F word okay, literally not.
Not, yes. You see why that's in my book. That definitely, because that
Everyone
is not
can buy
you
this
alone.
book.
And I want to say that it's possible actually the world will be ending. So just now it might be true.
Like soon.
Yeah, like tomorrow.
James?
Do you have further thoughts on honestly, or are we good to move on there?
I think we should move on.
Okay.
Honestly, do you think so?
Wow, and I want to get to pronouns before we leave
Oh,
today.
pronouns, yes, okay.
Well, that was my question, because there's a lot of publicity about pronouns. I know multiple organizations that have struggled mightily to develop approaches that would be appropriate for a whole organization to use in developing standards. Can you comment on that, and where is it going? Is this temporary, or is it going to increase?
So Valerie, just to set the scene, almost all of us are sort of bewildered by the whole pronoun thing. So be very basic in this. Tell us what's going on, the historical roots of this, and how you think about it.
Okay, Kevin, did you have something you wanted to say about the pronoun thing before I get started? Oh, okay. So pronouns, I mean, that, again, I have talked on many of these topics for too long because that is a topic we could spend a long time on, and I would have loved to get to it more thoroughly because it's fascinating. And a chapter of my book, not to buy the book, but if you are dying to know, I have a whole chapter on singular they in there. Pronouns are interesting because we feel like pronouns should be stable. It's not like other words that change, that come into language like finna or riz or sus or no cap that probably all of you have never heard of and are looking at me bewildered. But these words come and go. Slang comes and goes, new words. But pronouns shouldn't come and go, right? We don't feel like that should change over time, and we should use them in the way they've always been used. We have these really strong feelings about things that have been grammaticized into our language, and they have been grammaticized, meaning they've taken on grammatical meanings. They stand in for nouns. But the history of pronouns is actually very, very shifty in the history of English. And they is not even an original English pronoun. It is not an Anglo-Saxon word. They came in because of the problem of gender identification in Old English, which is interesting because that's exactly the reason it's come in now. In Old English, the word for plural third persons was hio. The word for a single masculine pronoun was he, or hey, actually. And the word for a third person feminine subject was he. But as sound changes came in, they all fell together as hey. And that means that I was calling a woman a hey, a man a hey, and everybody hey. H-E was how it was spelled.
So no use, because we can't distinguish.
Right, so it was useless. So when the Vikings came over, to have a little holiday on the British Isles, and, maybe did a little pillaging and plundering while they were there, we at least got something out of the trade. And I say we as an English speaker, not as an Anglo-Saxon. But what we got out of the trade as an English speaker is the pronoun they, along with other handy words like skirt and egg. And so they is actually a new word. And as early as Chaucer, we start seeing it used not only for third person plural, but Chaucer used it as a third person singular pronoun. So this whole singular pronoun they is actually 700 years old. He used it, though, in the way that I think all of you probably use it, which is what we call an epicene pronoun, where you say something like, everybody loves their mother.
Right.
when I'm talking about my own mother.
'Cause we used to say
a
his or
person,
her
his
mother,
or
he
or
or
everyone
she.
should check their ticket, because
Right.
everyone is actually a singular subject.
We gave up on this one a number of
We gave
decades ago.
up on that one. And how many of you would say you probably use it that way?
No, all the time. Everyone in their
I'm
cat.
almost sure all of you use it that way, even if you don't think you do. That epicene pronoun, in at least spoken language, maybe not in written, although younger speakers use it in both. Where it really starts to bother us, though, is not when it's used in this epicene use, but when it's starting to be non-binary. And what we find is when studies look at who most finds it non-congruent when we're using it with singular subjects like John or Kathy or Kay. So John wants their coffee delivered by 9 a.m. tomorrow. That's the use that seems to bother people the most, where the referent or the antecedent of that pronoun refers back to a named gendered subject in our traditional gendered thinking.
So Jill, we think, is a woman.
And John would be a man, right, in traditional thinking. Well, millennials and those born after don't seem to think that way. They don't seem to have gender marking in their syntax for names in the same way that older adults do. And when we run studies looking at who thinks certain things sound weird or which are incongruent and problematic, it is at the millennial generation and those born after that don't seem to have a problem with that kind of processing. So it really is something that it's just a matter of what you were raised being used to and how it seems to have gender marking cognitively for you, along with those words that mean proper names. And as we move through generations, those usages won't be odd at all. And so they came about not because we didn't try to come up with other names, so it seems logical, let's just come up with a different pronoun. The Swedish did it, right? They have hen, and that works for them. Let's just call them hens. The problem is we've tried that over 200 times for 300 years, and not a single one of them has stuck. What did stick is they, which moved into that role organically for almost all of us over 700 years. So it was a very natural movement from using it in that context to using it with a proper name where gender could be neutral.
But let me play the devil's advocate for just a moment. So many people believe that the LGBTQ plus community is holding the rest of us hostage for things that we're quite tolerant of, but why should this have to be in every corporate headquarters? Why should this be in every university? Why should that admittedly minority part of the demographic have enormous power over something that works quite well in the traditional way we have used he, she, they, and so on? I think a lot of people resent this, that this change is being forced on us. It's an important
question, and I think it is a little different than the cancel culture we're talking about earlier, where we're talking about offensive terms more generally. But I think the key is here is who gets the power to choose their own name. And this is what the fundamental issue is. It's not that people are telling you have to call yourself they. It's that people are saying,
you have to call me they.
You have to call me they. That my name is Valerie. If you ever call me Val, I will not speak to you again. Just putting it out there right now. I don't like being called Val. Do I get called Val? Yes. Do I call you back? No. Because it's not what I choose to name myself. No, I will politely correct you the first time and I'll give you some, grace, but the second time we're done. So I think it's the same thing. Why would my pronoun choice really matter to you so much? Because it's not asking you to call yourself that. It's asking you to respect who I see myself to be in the way that you name me. And while I'm not on the bandwagon for many of the cancel culture issues, right? I personally have found it sometimes restraining in my teaching and making us sort of silent in our conversations. I don't agree that telling someone else they don't have a right to their own chosen identity, I don't think that's okay. And I think that's where we really have to make this leap when we're talking about pronouns. If I choose to be a she, I choose to be a she. No one's going to argue with me on that. But if you feel like you're made more visible by being represented by the pronoun they, and I choose then not to use it, what kind of comment is that making about my respect for you as a person?
Fair enough.
I might as well call you shithead.
But fair enough. But on the other hand, if someone says to you, let's say you are non-binary, or that you prefer they, and we're in a group and someone says, who just raised their hand? And I say it was she. And then if you say, how dare you, I'm they, that shaming, that sense that I don't know, I'm not sure.
But have you really had anybody ever
People do
that?
have yes, this does happen.
I think that's wrong, right? That's a
it's
really
the shaming
problem.
again. It's the
Right.
righteousness. And then I think, whoa, now what? I don't even know what to do anymore, right? And so I think we're learning, and this will pass.
But I think that's sort of like the shark attack, honestly, that we hear those stories.
You don't think that's very common?
I teach 30 young people every year, and I have never once ever had anybody shame me for calling them the wrong pronoun. And I will admit, I did have one year where I always ask my students if they have pronouns they prefer me to use to let me know. And we actually have something on our website and sort of our web campus that they put their pronoun choices if they choose to. And so I make the assumption if you don't put it, that you're probably choosing a traditional path.
Right.
But some people just don't because they are students and they never go on there and probably only ever show up for the final exam. So I can't honestly say that that's why they're doing it. But I had a student that had a name that was very androgynous. They also had a sort of, presentation that was very androgynous. And I honestly had no idea. And I also don't want to call out someone in class and say, hey, what pronouns do you go by? Because that would obviously be uncomfortable. And I used every pronoun for this student in the course of a class, and not once did they say anything to me about it being offensive. In fact, told me what a great class it was and how lovely it was. Now, I was hoping they would correct me if, I was wrong, and they didn't choose to, nor did it seem to offend them. And then I have a friend or a colleague that chooses to go by they, and they told me that one time in a business meeting, after explaining that they prefer they called themselves he. And then instantly said, oh my gosh, I meant they. I'm getting used to it myself. And so I do think that is normally the reaction, and if that's not the reaction, that's a problem with them and not with you. So I think we need to be able to be a little uncomfortable, but we don't need to make other people super uncomfortable when they make truly honest mistakes. If you persist in it, that's a different
That's a very different thing.
Yeah, simple question. I was at a medical office a couple days ago. I was checking out, or two middle-aged women checking me out, and I wanted to say thank you, but I didn't know whether to say, you obviously don't say ladies, you don't say girls, because they're
definitely don't say girls.
Huh?
I say you definitely don't want to say girls.
No. So I didn't know what to say. I just said, I guess thank you. So
that seems good enough,
and
right?
Which was perfect.
Yeah.
First of all, I thought you said they were checking you out, but what you really mean... But what you mean is they were actually checking you out.
Clay knows this at my age. They aren't checking me out.
Well, I thought you would be thanking
What do you
for
call
that.
a group of women? If you were to address a group of women, what would you call them?
Thank you all.
Right there.
Or just thanks. Thanks, I think, is the right thing.
We'll get to a few more. I'm sorry. We'll go a little late, but not much here.
What's going on with people dropping T's? It's important, not important.
Oh, I love that one. Actually, I have in my book that's coming out in April of next year. I just finished writing it. I have a whole section on T dropping. And I will say that I am a tea dropper myself, and that's because I'm Southern, so it often is regionally distributed, and Southerners tend to drop T's. So the name of Atlanta is, for anybody from Atlanta, Atlanta. Toronto. So it's very common, and it actually is a very complex phonetic process where the T is between a stressed and an unstressed syllable with a nasal consonant. So it's a very, very patterned deletion, and it's caused because of the way that T's and N's are made together, and it's a ease of articulation aspect. So it happens a lot, but where it gets constrained is when dialects don't like it, right? When speakers don't do that typically, then it really is noticeable when other people do it. And it's something that seems to be increasing in frequency.
And why now?
More dialects are doing it.
Why now?
I think it's probably because it's taken on an association with certain varieties of English that have gotten cachet, and those then spread out beyond their originating group. And the T dropping is actually something that is fairly prevalent in African American English, and Southern African American English particularly. African American English has really gotten a lot of cred now that it didn't have before with the internet. It's really, really popular for slang. It's also very popular for different kinds of features. And as that's become more popular, young people in particular, Gen Z, have really emulated a lot of African American speech style, and I think that's where it's coming from.
James, we're out of time. What are we going to do here?
One more. So just a little context on my question, this past summer I was visiting my sister in Germany and bumped into a young German man who wanted to practice his English on me. And he said he came across a video where there was a dialect and he couldn't understand what the people were saying, and this is his words, not mine. He said they kind of sound a little bit stupid, and there's a long hiking trail. So I said, the Appalachian Trails, and we came to Appalachia. So can you talk a little bit about dialects and kind of their origins of how people talk across the country and how we use different words for the same thing, like soda or pop?
Okay. Oh my goodness. Now you're really hurting me here. Like, talk about this huge issue, 2 minutes. Oh, well, yes. First of all, Appalachian English is really a great topic that I could go on with forever. But the traits that a lot of times people most notice about it are actually relic features from Elizabethan English. And that doesn't mean it's, Shakespeare in the holler, which is one thing it's been referred to, because all of our speech has relics of Elizabethan English. What's different about those relics is they're ones that faded out in other varieties of English. So really what we have in Appalachian dialects is features that were retained from long ago. And so a-prefixing is one of those really lovely examples, which is also a fascinating history, but I was a hunting and I was a fishing, right? That's actually a relic feature that was really widespread in colonial English, but has since only died out and is only spoken really in Appalachia.
Because of geographic isolation.
Because of geographic isolation, but also identity, all these different features. American dialects are actually the topic of my next book, and so I've written 300 pages on it, so saying something in 2 minutes is impossible. But regional varieties are really interesting because historically speaking, colonial English in the 1600s and early 1700s were actually often remarked on by travelers as having no dialect, right? But being unique in that way because British English had so many different varieties, and that American English was remarkably uniform. In fact, it's one of the most common things that was said about really early colonial English. But over time, fissures among the early colonists and geographic isolation, and also really interesting dialect mixture with later arrivals. So we had a lot of German arrivals in the Midland district, usually in Pennsylvania first, right? And that had to do with really how accepting the Quakers were of people from other countries. We had a lot of Scotch-Irish, we had a lot of German settlement in the Midland area, and that is what really founded the Heartland dialect of America. You had a lot of Southern British settlement in New England, and they had a lot of continued ties with Southern Britain. And as innovations in Southern British English happened in the 19th century, like dropping R's and saying aunts instead of aunts, those innovations traveled because they were prestige innovations to the New England area, but they were really not very valued or had a lot of contact with people outside of that area. So that's why you get the very distinctive New England accent or Eastern New England accent. The South is a really interesting history, very much driven by West African language, and there's so much to go into there, and there's very nuanced differences in different parts of the South, but historically, a lot of Southern British settlement, then some Scotch-Irish that came later, and a really heavy West African substrate. And those basically gave us the three dialects regions of America. How'd I do?
Very nice. And you both get last licks. You've now gotten to know our community a little bit. You've heard the questions, and you've had some time here. Give us a closing thought. Give us something to think about as we go home, as we get around the dinner table.
35 seconds for you. Go ahead.
Great, go. Okay. Well, I think the closing thought I want to put out there is that linguistic empathy isn't hard, but it can be uncomfortable. And getting used to new things is hard for all of us. I mean, I still haven't figured out my phone. So I think if we look at language like an iPhone, has it really changed our life? If we take social media out of the picture, yes, the cell phone has done wonderful things to us. Does it have some negative aspects? Absolutely. But have we learned to appreciate it? Absolutely. I think we have to look at language change in much the same way, that it is a technological improvement, even if it doesn't always feel that way.
I have just two things to say, besides thank you. Tomorrow night, I'll be debating Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky in this valley, and we will be talking about which of the founding fathers was the indispensable one. And I think you know where I stand on that. So I do hope you'll come. There's a huge number of people from around the country that are tuning in because they love to watch her beat up on me, but that's another question. The second thing I want to say is about language. So Dr. Johnson, Samuel Johnson, wrote the Dictionary of the English Language, published 1755. It was one of the greatest works of philology in history. It's the basis of the Oxford English Dictionary, and he innovated a whole set of new ways of looking at words. And he wrote a famous preface to his dictionary, and he was a prescriptivist, that there are standards, and if we lock it in, if we lock this language in, and once and for all, nobody will ever dare to deviate. The French still engage in a lot of that prescriptivism to this day, as you know. At the end of his famous preface, he said, "I now realize that language is incapable of being locked." He said, "We may as well chain the wind. You cannot chain the wind." And so he became a de facto grumpy descriptivist because he realized that prescriptivism, although admirable, was impossible to enforce. And I don't think I'm not a prescriptivist at all, but you forced me to be by the crap that comes out of your mouth all the time. But we love you and we so appreciate you, so thank you for being here.
Hear, hear. Ladies and gentlemen, Clay Jenkinson and Dr. Valerie Fridland.
Thank you.